Hello and welcome to the GW Book Club, where I am joined by my good friend Stu to chat about classic Warhammer and Games Workshop books. This time, we're going to be taking a look at Warhammer Armies Undead from the fourth edition of Warhammer Fantasy. Stu, how are you doing, mate? You all right?
Really good. Always good when we're covering a fourth edition book because these are
Yeah.
just brilliant. Love them.
Yeah. It is like the era of Warhammer Fantasy Armies book that's just like perfect in many ways, right?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I, I think at the time I would have looked on the covers as a little bit too cartoony. I can remember thinking, oh, having enjoyed third edition so much, I missed some of the darker elements of it. But nostalgically looking back on the covers now, I love them. But it's the content
Hmm.
that's amazing. They set up everything we know now, and every time we review one of these, we end up saying something very similar along the lines of this was the initial time that they told all these stories that evolved into the lore that's repeated again and again now.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I know what you mean about those covers, right? Because they are absolutely amazing, like really beautiful. Like very like very colorful, right? There's a lot you get a lot
Yes.
of like quite bright colors, even for the undead, and there's obviously a lot of black on here, but there's also like purple and red, and there's like
Hmm.
blues. There's like quite vibrant, I suppose you might say. It was Dave Gallagher's cover for this Armies book,
Yeah.
and he did a lot of other amazing like covers as well. But yeah, it is a yeah, cartoon. I know what you mean by cartoon. It's not quite cartoony in one sense,
Yeah.
right? But it
Yeah.
is
It's not a
kind of
cartoon image at all. That's a terrible way of
no, but
describing it.
there's a certain
So
something.
apologies, but
I know what you mean.
it's red era. It really
Yeah,
signifies that red era Games Workshop, and I love it now, and I love looking back on it. But there was a point in it shows you can be a grognard even in your teens. I can remember when fourth edition started to kind of bed in a bit more, and more of these books came out. It was a case of I love this, but also I kind of miss
Mm.
the feel of third edition. Looking back on it now, I love it completely. But it makes you understand why people get to different eras within the game and go, "Oh, I used to love it with," and I found I was doing it myself, even as a like 15, 16-year-old.
Yeah, no, I can understand it. I think it's interesting as well, looking back at second edition or third edition rather, where you can actually see like some of the color plates that they would have in some of the supplements like Warhammer Armies. Then they are quite colorful as well and quite cartoony in the same way, like not exactly the same style, but some of those layouts do have some similarity with this era of Armies book cover. So there is a bit of continuity there.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what I find really interesting about Warhammer and the Armies books in particular is like I love fourth edition. I think if anybody were to say like what's your favorite set of Armies books, I would say fourth edition. But then
Yeah.
also I really love like sixth edition Armies books as well. Like because they take it in a completely different direction, but and it is amazing and it's probably my favorite version of the Warhammer world. Like from like that I inhabit, if that makes sense. Like
Hmm.
fourth edition is the version that I grew up with, which was like really important, which is all the foundational kind of view, for me, the kind of foundational view of the lore and the world. Fifth edition obviously is basically fourth edition just continued. Sixth edition does something very different and is a world that I like to return to like tell stories in. So I enjoy
Yes.
telling like playing games in that era as well. And then eighth edition has other things, like I think that those armies books are really beautiful objects, and like they're
Hmm.
really nice as well, just like as things.
Yes.
So I find it really, I basically love all armies books. I think is my problem, but yeah, I think this era is a very special era for me, and I'm sure for a lot of other folks as well. Not least because it is the first era of like
Yeah.
dedicated Warhammer Armies books. For these guys, for this faction, Undead, it is the only dedicated Armies book that exists, right? This is the only time
Yeah.
it's the collective Warhammer Armies Undead, because for the next set of Armies books that will come out, they will be Vampire Counts and Tomb Kings.
That's right.
So,
Yeah.
you kind of get something really interesting and quite unique with this one as well. What's your sort of general, thinking about the whole book in its entirety? Like, what's your general feel about it? Are you like a fan of this version of Undead in Warhammer?
Yeah, I was because it still reminds me of what was there before, which was that skeleton horde box set. It still
Yeah.
feels like that lives within it. It's not just because some of the miniatures still exist. It just feels like it's that evolved. It's like this thing works. It's beforehand. It was almost like Undead. Every fantasy game has Undead. You get this. You don't need to be taught what sort of shambling skeletons are. You see this in loads of different media, films, whatever. So Undead are undead, but this starts to sort of bring it into the Warhammer world, and you've got characters being born, and rules for them, and they start to feel like it's on that path to what we know today. And even though it goes into vampire counts and to Tomb Kings, those core characters that we now have in those separate armies are all here, and that intertwining story of Nagash and the Tomb Kings and the areas of the vampire counts in the old world are all kind of melded together here. It's the origin story for most of it. So it does everything for me. So it's still got the old feel inside the book, and it's all the paths towards the stuff that we know now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's something in this book that is lost for me in later versions of Undead. Not that I don't love vampire counts. I think vampire counts are great, actually. Tomb Kings, I'm not as keen on, just generally. I think they're so like hyper focused on a particular aesthetic that isn't necessarily for me. And
Hmm.
what you get in here is the third way of Undead, which
Mm.
is the kind of like it is the ghosts and like it's the Barrow Wights from Tolkien. It is just like weird supernatural stuff just hanging out in graveyards in the old world. And I think a lot of that comes from like I think reading through this book there is loads of like cinematic influences. I think no other Warhammer book is owes quite so much to movies as this one because of the sort of twin horror icons of the Universal monsters and
Hmm.
Hammer horror. And I think both of
Yeah.
those filtered through like the Citadel range that got you to here, they all find a place here. So you get your like you get all of the mummies and from classic Hammer horror stories and from classic like Universal monsters mummy movies they're here, but then there's also literally like Boris Karloff vampire guys like running around. And yes,
Yes.
we're already moving towards what will be vampire counts. And Manfred von Carstein's here. They're all here
Hmm.
already, but there's still shades of the like tuxedo cape wearing vampire. Like they're still just about and that's because they were in the earlier Citadel Rangers as well, right? You had
Yeah.
all of the stuff that were those Draculas, like 20 different Draculas running around, and Frankenstein's monsters and ghouls and all of those kind of like different types of ghosts and wights and stuff like that. So all of that's still here. I mean, I love the idea. You know, we get Krell, we get an updated version of Krell here. I love the idea of
Yeah.
Krell because he's this continuation of like the Chaos Skeleton Warrior, which was a bigger thing in earlier Citadel miniature ranges. Because that's just wild. That's just like a completely other different thing. That's a cross, as Warhammer becomes more sort of distinct and kind of sorts itself out into these different categories over time, you lose these weird things that exist in the in between. That's the reason you lose the sort of skeleton horde and
Yeah.
the old sort of shambling Ray Harryhausen style skeletons. They
Yeah.
kind of get lost because they don't neatly fit in a Tomb King's sort of Egyptian undead army, or really, they don't quite fit in a ghoul based, wet undead army of vampires as well. So this is a great era for me because you get all of it. You get a bit of everything. It's a smorgasbord of just like undead delights, I think.
True. Of course, though, they kept those skeletons for both ranges and
Sure.
used the same skulls.
Yeah. Yeah, but the feel wasn't quite the same, I guess.
I know you. It's how you paint them, isn't it? I guess in some ways, but I know what you're guessing at.
Yeah.
They don't look like they're. You don't imagine. You no longer imagine them as a scene from Jason and the Argonauts when
Right.
they're kind of clinking along.
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
either kind of
Exactly.
crawling out of the ground or they're dusty. There's a different element to it. But I do know what you mean, and you explained it far better than I did when I was bumbling around. But the, the all of those key players are there from every horror you can
Yeah.
imagine, and it is quite charming
It
in
is
many
charm.
ways.
That's the right word. Yeah, yeah, completely. Yeah. But yes, this is also so, and part of that journey to sort of creating these distinct flavors of undead that we'll get later on starts here with the introduction of Nagash. Right now,
Yeah,
I've tried to double check this. I haven't fully confirmed this. There may be a reference to Nagash somewhere else, and I've not sort of nailed it down yet. But I believe this is the first time we sort of get proper introduction of Nagash, who this person is, what their lore is, and the positioning of them as very central to Warhammer's sort of concept of necromancy and undead. Essentially they created necromancy themselves after learning
yes,
elements of it from the Dark Elves, which is really interesting. Obviously, Nagash, great character, has some really fun stories in the Warhammer world. It's a lot of power and a lot of like lore to put into the hands of a single character. Um,
yes.
what's your feeling on Nagash here? Like, just this era and knowing what Nagash will go on to become for Warhammer.
Yeah, I don't know really. It's just I've always loved undead from a visual point of view. I've never been hugely into their lore. I don't get as excited reading about Nagash as I do reading about Empire Elector Counts or something like that. So I've always had a slightly distant relationship to them. They are the bads, and I'm
Mm,
happy for them to be the bad. So I don't really have any emotional connection to Nagash. I've enjoyed the more modern stories with him, and he's obviously so pivotal at so many different points throughout the Warhammer World's history, including the end times.
mm,
But I still have never been super excited about that whole story arc. For me, they are the background to the big bads that hopefully my armies will come up against. So I don't really know. I don't, as I said, there's nothing stands out about
mm,
the way he's presented here that makes me think, oh wow, this is really different. It
mm.
just feels like this is our first sighting of him, and maybe that's clouded so much about how much I know he's going to form so many of the
Sure.
future stories within the Warhammer world.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard to get away from that long shadow that he will ultimately
Mm,
cast. I think it's dead interesting to me how I've talked. Obviously there's a lot of cinematic elements to the undead as they're presented here. Nagash, though, is despite being like aesthetically like Egyptian, and we'll go into all of the stuff on that around Khemri and Nehekhara and all of that. I think that Nagash himself is probably the most Tolkien thing in this book. So
hmm
he represents Warhammer's Sauron, I think.
Yeah, yeah,
It is the dialogue is between Priestley and Tolkien, and he's saying this is I'm giving Warhammer its Sauron equivalent, and that is why he's got thousands of years of history. That is why he always comes back. He has his own magic crown in which an essence of him exists and exerts influence on people who wear it. He will always come back and will always be the thorn in the side of the good people of the old world. One thing that is really super interesting to me, at least, is that in the TV show Rings of Power,
hmm
which is based on Tolkien's work, broadly speaking, they introduce a concept in that show where Sauron and spoilers for Rings of Power, and it's a flashback. So hopefully, it's not too spoilery. But you see an earlier version of Sauron who gets betrayed and killed, and then spends centuries sort of recoalescing as this kind of black goo that kind of all comes back together and then reforms into the body of Sauron so that he can return and do some bad stuff again. And that scene, almost identical, which was created for Rings of Power. I don't believe it's in the Silmarillion or any of Tolkien's
no,
actual
I don't
stuff.
think so.
That scene is almost beat for beat exactly how it is described that Nagash reformulates after getting destroyed. So that's a
Hmm.
really interesting like circle of inspiration. Now I don't know whether the Rings of Power writers are like big Warhammer Fourth Edition Undead Armies book fans, and they were like, "We've got to do that," or maybe it's just parallel thinking, and it's just a common idea. But it's so similar that I found it dead interesting that if Priestley and the Warhammer writers were inspired by Tolkien to create Nagash in the first place, and then he operates in a certain way and comes back from the dead in a certain way, and then the writers of a later Tolkien inspired work would then take inspiration from this, or at least create something very similar to this. I thought that was a wild coincidence at the very least.
Yeah, sure. I hadn't made that connection actually, but it's a good one. I
It's
wonder
interesting.
if that
Yeah.
idea of reformation comes from somewhere else as well,
Yes,
and
and
they both
that's
taken
probably
that
more
influence.
likely. Actually, you're right. Yeah, maybe it is. Maybe there's some like biblical story or other
Hmm.
story, some older story. Maybe it's in Beowulf or something. I don't know. And
Yeah,
and everybody's referencing that same thing. That probably makes even more sense. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, I think the fact that Sauron, and you even have Mordor basically, right?
yeah,
Nagashazir as his sort of homelands. There's just loads of stuff that says to me that this is how we're going to get Sauron into the Warhammer world without him being actual Sauron, and as they always did when they did the greatest work of Warhammer, they were like, okay, well, we're going to reference or we're going to be inspired by or homage something else, and oftentimes that was Tolkien, but we're gonna do that to something else, but we're going to find a way to make it ours, and we're going to give it
hmm
our own like Warhammer flavor. And I think they do that here, not just through his sort of Tomb Kings relationships, but also his like relationship with the Skaven, which I think is fun. That there's all Nagash and the Skaven are just these like bitter, like I kind of see them as like they're both villains, obviously, but they're almost like villainous next door neighbors who just they
yes,
never actually sort of kill each other. They're just always squabbling, which I think is
yeah.
fun.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair.
But yeah, so you get so Nagash being this kind of big important character, I think is really interesting. We obviously have read in the book club the Drakenfels stories. We've
Hmm.
we've sort of got that story, and it kind of feels it's always felt a shame to me that Drakenfels was kind of dropped from Warhammer lore because I think it's a
Yeah,
very cool character. And I think ultimately the reason Drakenfels doesn't exist after those books is because Nagash quickly comes to exist. So it's only a few years
yeah,
later that Nagash appears, and all of the same sort of mechanisms that exist for Drakenfels. He lingers in the darkness. He always comes back. There's always these curses. I mean, and this is true of a lot of undead characters, right? They all come back. But as the sort of great big bad,
yeah,
Drakenfels is kind of displaced by Nick. You can't have two guys who are both, since the dawn of time, have been the most evil necromancer that's ever existed, really. So, yeah, we had to sacrifice Drakenfels to get Nagash, I think.
yeah, yeah. I think so. I think the fact that undead don't die is probably the most important point there. But yeah, I know what you mean. They would fit very much into the into the same space narratively because Dragonfels is more powerful than the other vampires we meet. The von Carstein family is a
Mm.
different level, so you don't need another level in between him and Nagash, well them and Nagash. So
Yeah,
it is a shame though. I would have quite liked a world where it was Drakenfels instead of Nagash. But
yeah. I
we
mean, it's
probably wouldn't have Tomb Kings then. I don't think it would have
yeah, true.
evolved off into that sort of direction.
Yeah, and that is, I suppose, the thing of Nagash is that, and this is what you do. This is where again the writers of various Warhammer books do great work is by giving lots of relationships. It's kind of like creating RPG characters where you want all of the hooks into different like
Mm.
dynamics. So you've got a reason for this character to spend time with that character to fight this army or that army. Nagash, obviously, his big story is around the Tomb Kings, but then you also get Nagash went out and fought Sigmar, and so he's kind of got an ancient grudge against the Empire. He's
Yeah.
fought against dwarves at times. he hates the Skaven because they're constantly stealing his warpstone and stuff like that. So you kind of get like some nice elements there. I do think I there. I don't want to say it's like a Mary Sue kind of situation with Nagash, but he's so powerful. You can see why he became a god in Age of Sigmar
Yeah.
because he creates necromancy, but he also created the vampires, and that was a completely different thing. Like that was a different project. He did both, and he did them for different reasons in different ways. And it's kind. I mean, I guess it makes thematic sense with like undead armies collapse when you destroy their leader. So the entire like undead faction and race, as it were, they're all tied to the same foundational being. I guess that's quite an
Yeah.
interesting sort of thematic choice. But it puts a lot of eggs in the Nagash basket. I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, he even before he became a god, he was demigod anyway, wasn't
Yes.
he? Is above so many other characters. Only chaos characters will be that
Mm.
kind of power level within the Warhammer world. So I think it probably is fun that you bring both dry and wet dead together under one unifying factor, but they are both different. They do work mechanically different, but like you said, they're very much the same way. It's probably a bit like rugby union and rugby league. They're both playing with the same shaped balls, but the rules are slightly different. But the end result is very, very similar. Sorry, rugby fans who hate what I've just said, but it's to anyone outside of the UK who haven't got a clue what I'm talking about as well. But I think it works actually. As much as I'm like you, I prefer the vampire undead rather vampire count than I do the Tomb Kings. I think that the fact that he connects both those story arcs so well and is the origins of both sides, I think actually makes it really, really interesting, much more in-depth, complicated, believable actually, because there's so many layers to it, narrative for Warhammer.
Yeah,
And it gives it some of that real gravitas that we know of the Warhammer story. So I
that's
think it's
true.
important.
Actually,
As
yeah.
much as it's not my favorite characters or my favorite stories, it's so detailed. There's so much going on that I think it just adds to the fake reality of
Mm.
of the story that's being told.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I suppose he is one of the few like characters who has that level of epic story, like mythological storyline. I suppose you've also got like, Malekith or Malarian as he is now,
Yeah,
like also has 1,000 year history tying into all of these different factions and events
true.
across time. There's not many others, I suppose. Now, I guess in the old world, we also have like the Dragon Emperor and some of those characters,
Yeah, yeah, true.
Cathay.
Like,
Because even like Teclis and Tyrion are much, much younger,
they
and
are
I
quite
don't know that
young.
there's any
Yeah.
dwarves that are as old. Regardless, I suppose.
No, they don't live that. They live a long time, but they're not that. They don't live as long as elves, and they're not ultimately as
Mm.
powerful
I
because
guess,
they're not innately magic, are they? And I think that's what it boils down to. Even with the gash, it's all about magical power.
yeah. Although, self-made man, he pulled himself up by
Yeah,
his bootstraps and invented necromancy. But I like that story of within the ancient empires, the most ancient human civilization. And I guess the Slan actually they are old, right? And Lord Croak and those lads are all will predate Nagash even, I imagine. But yeah, in the earliest human civilization, in Kemri and in Nehekara, it was Egyptian in style, in theme, in aesthetic. They created these mortuary cults who become obsessed with death, and there's kind of an interesting mirror with like the cult of Moor in the Empire and that sort of stuff. But then with the creation of necromancy, having learned it from the Dark Elves, Nagash goes on to then like supercharge this obsession with death and death magic, and then eventually creates into he becomes a living lich. Essentially,
yes,
he gets defeated, and then everybody he leaves behind in Nehekara, they all become liches and tomb kings and whatever else. So now there's a whole civilization of undead leaders with lots of undead armies just hanging out in pyramids, basically. And that's where you get Cetra. You know, you get the introduction of Cetra as well, which I know a lot of folks love Cetra.
Yes, yeah, and that's the first time in this book, isn't it? I think.
I believe so. Yeah, I think so. And
Yeah,
and probably was just we need a character because we've got a load of mummies that we've made.
yeah.
So
So we
we
need a
need
leader
one to
character for
represent
that,
this.
which maybe was the birth of what was later to be the Tomb King faction. Must be.
I think
Um,
a big part of it. Yeah, I think absolutely. I like Manfred von Carstein. I think the
mhm.
vampires for me are just cooler anyway as an
Yeah.
undead creature. I think ghouls are pretty cool as well. But having that nestled within the Empire and the Old World is really fun as well. And the fact that you
Hmm.
get this kind of, like there is this little thorn in the side of the Empire. It just gives you an excuse to have undead against everybody in the Old World. And
Yeah.
there's also this
Yeah.
kind of very cool, Sylvania is just this. It is Hammer horror, like
Mm.
in fantasy. It's the setting of every Hammer horror movie, so a sort of Eastern European shady kind of place. You go into a tavern and it all goes silent, and everybody looks at you, and you're not supposed to talk about the lord who lives up in the castle on the hill. It's that vibe as an army, and I think that's very cool. I quite like that.
I love anything that's Empire anyway, so that's probably why I prefer the vampires more. Just like you said, that kind of the proximity to normal human life, and the fact that it's kind of accepted or ignored out of fear, sometimes liaised with out of necessity. It's that element that we can deal with these people sometimes, but they're also really, really dangerous. And at times there'll be war. Other times we'll cautiously kind of almost deal with them, trade with them, etc. And I like the way that changes a little bit over the eras of Warhammer history, and yeah, it's more fun. It's more my flavour
Mm,
of Dead as well. I prefer Wet Dead like you to Dry Dead.
yeah.
I'd rather watch a vampire film than The Mummy.
You do get, I mean, really interesting actually, I think, and kind of ever present but not explored in quite so much detail, I suppose. So you get in this book a fair bit, relatively speaking, about Mousillon or
Yeah,
Mousillon in Bretonia. And it very much sets up. Okay, yes, you've got Sylvania, which is where the undead are in the Empire. You have got Nehekara, where the undead are outside of the Empire, and then you've got Mousillon in Bretonia as like a big potential source of ghouls and like all kinds of weird undead guys there. And the amount of word count that covers it is quite surprising, given that we don't then get a Bretonian army for the fourth edition of Warhammer Fantasy. It's really strange.
and also that we never get Musalon dealt with in any detail. Whereas if you think of the two kind of starting points in the book, or many starting points, the Cetra bit, well, we know where that goes.
Mm,
We know that we end up with a whole new faction. Musalon never really grew, if anything, shrunk beyond this. It was always just a footnote in timelines, isn't it? If anything,
yeah.
in your main rule book, in your timeline mentions the fall of, or in your Bretonia army book, when you get it, there's a little note that says this area went a bit bad, but there's not really any characters development or rules for that era, and it just shows that these are lots of ideas, and some things will remain
Mm.
background stories and footnotes, and some will end up being big story arcs in the future.
If memory serves, there might have been like a sizable section on Mousillon in the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay books. So it
Makes
could just
sense.
be carrying, that's already
Mm.
established some undead lore. Let's bring it in and reference it. I think that's the case. The other sort of carryovers that I'm very pleased were retained and got more detail were Heinrich Kemmler and Krell.
Yeah.
I've mentioned Krell already, but just these are characters who are amongst the earliest Warhammer Fantasy special characters. There are a couple from that era in second edition, and who's still around. Golfpack the Ogre is another example. But yeah, Kemmler and Krell, they have a really fun story. They have this intersection between undead and chaos and all of this sort of stuff. And you get that here, and you get this continuation. They're not quite as closely aligned here as they were prior to this. I think in
Hmm.
earlier stories you still get here that Krell is like a lieutenant who works for Kemmler, but I feel like there's a little bit more distance maybe between the two of them here.
Yeah, maybe it's just so that people feel they can use them on their
Probably.
own
Yeah, you can use them
a little
separately.
bit more. But it was nice to see them here, and they obviously endure as well. In fact, as much as we're both not huge enjoyers of the end times story arc, but
Yeah.
I did enjoy their parts in the end times
Right.
books. They were very enjoyable as characters to sort of almost be alive again in many ways to tell that tale. But it's nice to see them in here. It made me think, oh yeah, of course they're going to be in here. But when I was flicking through it, I didn't immediately expect to see them for some reason. I'm not sure what that was, but
Sure, yeah, yeah. And actually, Drakenfels himself sort of returns in the end times as well, doesn't he? And also has that overlap with Chaos in the same way as Krell. So,
mhm.
there's a little bit of that. The other, I mean, there's a couple of other characters, but I think Dieter Helsnick is pretty cool on his ridiculous manticore, and he also gets like a scenario in the like a very interesting scenario in the back of the book where it's like you fight two separate battles and one of them informs the other, like it tells you if the reinforcements make it to the main battle. I think that's pretty cool. Like
I love
logistically,
bits like that in games. Yeah.
I imagine that would be a nightmare to play unless you played the small battle first. But it
Yes.
kind of presents it as like do these at the same time.
Well, that's the fun way of doing it. It's not for Warhammer, but there's something that exists that way with Middle Earth strategy battle game where
Right.
you're doing different parts of Helm's Deep. So you either do the ride out bit or you do the to try and defend the gate, and you can do it. There's lots of little bits that it's quite cinematic, isn't it? So, and I think if you get your head round this is a cinematic game
Hmm.
and you work it out with your opponents that way, then it can be really really fun. It's already a good way of doing it.
That's neat. Yeah. Yeah, that is good. And then the other thing that is pretty cool in this, and is present in a few fourth edition books, a William King fiction. So
Yes.
we get a Gotrek and Felix story, essentially, a
Yeah.
small Gotrek and Felix story. I don't think it actually fits in with the Gotrek and Felix continuity, though. Uh,
No, it feels like it's just using their characters as a way of these are popular. I know how to write these characters. Let's put them in a scene. It's not
yeah,
even a
and
story, is it? It's more of a scene, a
yeah,
vignette of a tale to add flavor.
yeah,
But it works from that point of view.
it's fun because it's about the resurrection of Manfred von
Mm.
Carstein. So he's back. He's going to be out and about. I I think I thought going into because obviously I was familiar with this from this book, going into Vampire Slayer, the Gotrek and Felix
Mhm.
book, that that story would like link in and you would find the sort of framing of this scene. But
Right.
obviously it doesn't it kind of supersedes this scene. You go to a different vampire's castle and deal with a different vampire instead. Um, it is quite cool for Gotrek and Felix to have been there at the resurrection of Manfred von Carstein. That's pretty neat. But yeah, I mean, again, it's one of these things that could make the world a little bit too small if like everybody's always around together for all of the
True.
most important moments.
True. Yeah, there is an element to that. I think they get away with it. I think.
Oh, they do.
I think
Yeah, they do.
I think they get a free pass with a lot of things. But I mean, talking more about King's writing in these books, I think it adds to, for me, it adds to the consistency. Even though that they're not all written. A lot of these books, these fourth ed books, are written by Rick. They're not all, including this one. But I think the format of them is very clearly got Rick's thumbprints all over it, and the sheer amount of information in these books are very similar. There's everything you need. This is the foundation lore, as we've said so many times and in the intro as well. But also, getting back to my point, King's stories in these are really consistent as well, and they add a flavour that's consistent across all those fourth edition books, I think, and you just feel more of that here. They're not amazing stories. They're not going to win any awards. But they do what they're designed to do is
Mm.
break up big chunks of heavier, drier text, and be that rules or lore or whatever, with little bits of story here and there. Did like reliefs,
Yeah.
and I think they do it better in these books, in my opinion, than any of the little sort of narrative story bits you get in later army books or codexes, including 40k as well.
Yeah, there is quite a nice one, I think, with Nagash. Just sort of
Mhm.
sat. He's kind of been sat for centuries on his throne, sort of repowering himself, and then some thief comes in and tries to steal some stuff, and Nagash is like, "Oh, I guess I'll see how this plays out," before obviously vaporizing this guy. But yeah, that's quite a fun story of just the just the disconnect that Nagash now has with his
Mhm.
humanity because he's so far removed from it. I
Yeah,
should correct myself. I've misled you when I said it was Rick Priestley who wrote this one. It's actually Jervis
it's
Johnson who's the
Jervis. Yeah.
primary writer. Yeah, so apologies for that. I've just double checked. But yeah, I think that overall it is a great book. I think there's so much fun to have here. I think I should actually we ought to mention the amazing art throughout it.
Mm.
Loads of awesome Mark Gibbons pieces in here. Just
Yeah.
really really characterful. I was thinking of like which is my favorite piece in this book, and it's hard because there's so many great illustrations. Obviously, there's a load of really cool John Blanche ones, but I think for
Yeah.
me, it's the Mark Gibbons art that kind of takes this one even further. I think Blanche does some really nice, like Land of the Dead art, like with these kind of like necropolis looking places that are amazing. But I think possibly that properly iconic Nagash image that Mark Gibbons
Okay.
did, it's so good. Not just because of Nagash. Obviously, he looks incredible. It's the best possible version. Obviously the miniature. There are some people who hate it. There's some people who love it. I quite like the miniature now. I think at the time I wasn't too keen on it, but I've grown to love it because of its place in
Yeah, from an
history.
almost
Um,
nostalgia point.
but like taking that same broad design and making it into like a scary, like 10-foot character, and then
Yeah.
in front in the foreground you get all of these zombies, and they just you can tell that they're like, even though it's a black and white image, you can tell that their eyes are soulless and there's just this magic eminence coming from their eyes. Amazing, absolutely incredible piece.
It is awesome, yeah. And I struggled to choose a favorite actually. There's on page 18, there's a Mark Gibbons piece which I really like. Similar kind of style. Obviously, it's Mark Gibbons style, but I really like that. And it's a nice crossover between his style, but some of the more pencil art, the rougher stuff that you get. I really like that one.
Mm.
There's something on. I'm picking too many things here. That's not my favorite. I think that might be third place. On page 27, there's a beautiful piece that just
Oh,
got so much going on, and that's more what we were talking about with these big sort of vista and loads of stuff going on. Blanche, well, my favorite actually is that page 51, and it's a smaller image. I'm going to skip to it now so I don't describe it incorrectly. It says skipping to it.
oh yeah.
It's just on the top of the undead battle tactics section. I just really like it. And you've got the undead army lining up against the Empire army. I'd love to see this bigger. You've got your Empire
You
wizard
can see
there,
this
and
bigger. I think this was the same piece that was on. I think I'm right in saying this might have been on the Arcane Magic box set.
oh right,
And if it's
okay,
not on that, then I'm pretty certain it's on a Citadel Journal cover as well.
right. Yeah, I didn't picture it from that, but I just love it in black and white. There, it just
It's great.
looks looked really great. It's actually one of my favorite little sections of the book. Actually, it's in the middle of the what was obviously White Dwarf, the Revenge of the Doom Lord. You've got this narrative scenario in there that's almost sort of tells you what armies to pick if you want to, but you can play this battle. You can read the story of the battle because the lore's in there. Unlike modern versions of the game where they just lead you up to the point, this actually tells you what happened in the historical version of it. And you've got tactics you can use, but then you've also got the rosters if you want to use the armies for it, all in this weird kind of amalgamation of a section of a book,
Yeah.
which is quite weird. And that's partly because it's obviously a magazine article that's been placed into an army book. But I really quite like it. It does multiple things. If you want to just a scenario to play the game, you can just take the scenario element. If you can't play the game, well, you can still get a feel for it, look at the maps, but then read the story of it, and then read about Undead tactics as all part of it. I just think it's a really unusual way to present
Mm.
that within in an army book, and it's very different. You wouldn't see that in an army book now.
No, I think you're right, and it's neat because it does give you different flavors of the game. It allows you to sort of tackle the same idea, the same battle, in a couple of different ways, however you
Yeah,
might like to play it. You're right, of course. Part of the way that these books worked was that they literally would republish stuff in White Dwarf because that would cover the cost of actually
yeah,
creating it in full color. That's why most of the book is black and white. So that's the reason that there's loads of like repeated stuff because when you did it in White Dwarf as pages for White Dwarf, and then that sold enough copies that actually that paid for your color pages. You got them for
yeah,
free to put them into the Armies book. So it's the economies of it wasn't full color because they couldn't afford it back in the day. There's also an interesting point there actually around you get Vlad and Isabella von Carstein, the vampires. They're dead at this point in Warhammer history. Like they're properly dead because they were killed many centuries earlier. Manfred is the only von Carstein left.
that's right. Yeah, yeah,
But this was a really interesting thing around, and it sort of still happens, but like because Warhammer was a setting and not a story, much more so at this time, that you would get these historical characters that you sort of essentially could play historical games and recreate stuff that had already happened using these older characters, and that was just a cool thing you could do. And I think
mm,
that came from the fact that a lot of the writers of Warhammer at the time were historical gamers. They played historical
yeah,
games, so they were always playing games that had already happened, and you're recreating them. So there's quite an interesting thing there, I think. That kind of has died away a little bit as we've moved to, the distinction between setting and story has kind of closed a little bit. And we're closer to there's a continuing story across these games, and the characters who are around are all the characters who are alive, and they are active agents in the story now more often than not, I think.
yeah. I think absolutely that's something that I see it now in arguments in forums and on Facebook or in comments on videos about well they didn't care about timelines before. They used to just have the characters in the books and they wouldn't all be alive at that point when you could play whatever you want, as an argument for, well, why don't they do it now? Why don't we have some of these old characters within the new old world timeline? Because it just shouldn't matter, we should just be able to play with them. And I kind of, it's nice from a historical point of view. I'm not sure. I'd want things from the future, maybe, but yeah, we don't have.
Well, that's
That's
an
only a
interesting
now problem,
thing.
isn't
Yeah.
it? It's a
Yeah.
now problem rather than a then problem, because they
Sure.
were always at the definitive point of the timeline then. Whereas now we're looking back at or looking back and forwards
Mm.
at timelines. But I think yeah, you're right. They used to do it a lot. It didn't have any real impact negatively. I don't think anyone even thought about it.
I don't
If
think
you
they
wanted
did.
to do an army based around that, you just do it, and
Yeah.
it wouldn't matter. You just play the game based on that. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and I quite like it. I think I'm probably the worst type of gamer though when it comes for Games Workshop, at least because I want my cake and I want to eat it. So I want the historical characters. I want the choice to be able to go, oh yeah, this is set 400 years before the current timeline, and we're just playing a load of elves who have long since died off. But I also like a continuing story, so I want both things at the same time. But
Cool.
I think it would be really cool to have some. I would hope that we will get we have had some characters in the old world who
Yeah.
are around by the time of Warhammer Fantasy's end times.
Yes.
And you get kind of younger versions. I personally think it would be really cool to just have like, okay, can we have Kemler and Krell? Can we have Nagash and Manfred von Carstein? and they're just around. You could have Vlad and Isabella, even though they are dead, even before the old world takes place. But like, it would be cool to see them and to be able to use the old world rules with new like stats for those characters. I think that would be cool. I'd be up for that. If an opponent came to me and said, "Oh, I want to play with Grom the Paunch," I'd be up for it in the old world, I think.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. But yeah, so not everyone's like us, Jordan. Not everyone likes the.
Sure. Is there anything else, Stu, from the Undead Armies book for fourth edition that's like, another extra thing that you wanted to call out?
One other bit of the book I absolutely love is incredibly simple. Is the inside cover, and it's just an heavy metal page.
Mhm.
And as much as I said at the beginning that we were edging into that red era, this for me it has the right balance between the third ed sort of visuals and the red era stuff. It's just a beautiful image. The scenery, the scratch built terrain is really, really cool. And it just sums up the era for me perfectly. Lovely bit of scratch built terrain that just sums up the way I feel about Warhammer, the way my nostalgic look of Warhammer, I think.
It is. It was great. Yeah, it's so good, and it's because it's. I mean, I say it's simple. I'm sure it was not simple to make, but it's relatively simple. But yeah, the scratch built terrain's awesome. You've got bits of miniatures in there as well. There's like the imp, like
Yes.
familiar holding on the top. Is that Mortarion from Epic in the background as well?
Oh,
On the
yeah, I think
statue, I
so.
think, which is just great. I mean, that's
Good
so
spot.
cool. And then yeah, you've got these whites and you've got vampires. It's fantastic. I love that vampire count. That's such a classic miniature. It's so good. Stu, I'm sure we could keep talking about all the cool stuff that's in here, but we've got to draw it to a close. I apologize to you and to everybody else for some of the technical issues I've been having with my internet whilst we've recorded this. Hopefully, folks didn't even know that had happened, and we've edited around it and it was smooth and fine. But we're going to come back in the future with more book clubs. We're going to look at other Warhammer Armies books and codexes from lots of different eras in the future. Until then, where can people find you online, Stu?
Follow me on Miniature Realms on YouTube and social media and stuff as well.
Fantastic. And I'm Jordan Sorcery pretty much everywhere if you want to check out more of my stuff. Until next time, thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.